Yeah, good evening, Wellspring, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. I'm joined this evening by two friends and members of our congregation, Keith Osborn and Chantal Smith. Chantal is an LMFT, and she's been a therapist, practicing therapist for 7 years. Keith is an LCSW, and he's been helping folks as a counselor and therapist for half a century. So we've got 57 years of wisdom here. And I want to thank you guys for joining us. Actually, the idea for this evening really came out of some of the discussions between Pastor Kevin, Pastor Wes, and myself. And with the phone calls that we've been making, connecting with you guys, hearing from, where you're at, what you're dealing with, what you're thinking about, we thought it just might be helpful to have a discussion amongst the three of us about what we're seeing in terms of what we're experiencing from some of you as we talk to you, and how we might provide some wisdom, some helpful insights, some techniques, some strategies to navigate this unprecedented pandemic that we're going through. So that's the heart for tonight. I guess overall, it's thinking about how can we practice good mental health, good emotional health techniques and practices, as we navigate a global shaking, if we could, give it that backdrop. So Chantal, I'd like to start with you. As we were talking about this last week, you said that a couple weeks ago you went through kind of a downtime yourself. And I think it'd be great to start with that. Like, tell us what you were experiencing, and what did you do to help pull out of that downward slide that you found yourself in?
And so just to explain a little bit about the downward spiral that I was experiencing, I've always had a baseline of anxiety. And I think that just being a student, whether it was being an athlete or being now a mental health professional, you're able to cover it up pretty well, just because there's just so much that goes on in life that you don't really have time to slow down and to realize the things that you're experiencing. And so with COVID, it really brought to the surface a lot of unresolved anxiety that I was dealing with. And I literally found myself so low that luckily my sister took me in. She allowed me to move in with her during the quarantine, because I was just completely shooken and just scared 24/7. I was having trouble sleeping. I was not sleeping. I would wake up in the middle of the night, literally in cold sweats. And it wasn't like COVID related symptoms or anything like that, but I would go to the bathroom and it looked like I ran 10 miles. And I had never experienced panic attacks or anything like that. And I think what I was experiencing, just because I know I'm a mental health professional, was more so night terrors or nighttime panic attacks, where I'd wake up and I'd be shaking for at least 20 minutes. And that was something that it wasn't just about the anxiety. It brought a lot of guilt and shame up for some reason. I was just so ashamed of the way that I was handling it. I was having these ideas that I'm a Christian, I should be able to, just lean on God, and that should be enough. And at that moment, it wasn't enough, and my body was taking over for me. And I think it was a lot of unconscious stuff, again, coming to the surface. But I was really shaken about how I was dealing with it, and about the guilt that I was experiencing, because I thought that I was not handling it well. And also just that I'm a mental health professional. How can I help people if I'm literally having night sweats myself and not being able to sleep? And then about a week or two ago, instead, I almost turned the TV on after one of the episodes at night. And instead of doing that, I decided I could either be distracted or I could choose to press in. And I chose to press in, and I got my Bible out, and I started to gather almost this arsenal of tools that would help me. And where I didn't have to like get up or do something. I would hold it like right next to my bed. And it was my Bible. It was a book by Bill Johnson. And instead of like being distracted by TV or just doing like monotonous things just to get me through like the hour or 2 hours that I'd be up anyway, I decided to press in. And I saw a shift take place where I knew that I was now engaging in spiritual warfare, and I felt more so like a warrior than a victim. And that really was the shift for me. I decided that instead of just being scared, and I was gentle with myself and understood that no, I never pandemic before, so I didn't understand if there was like a right or wrong way to do it. But I definitely realized that I'm going to press in, and if anxiety wants to come, I'm going to give it the fight of its life. And I think that athletic mindset that I've had because of being a previous athlete, and realizing that it was spiritual warfare, that was the shift for me. And I felt more empowered versus feeling afraid.
That's really good. Thank you. Appreciate your vulnerability. And may want to come back to a couple of things that you raised in a moment. Keith, want to turn to you. So are you still seeing clients during this time?
I'm seeing clients on Zoom or FaceTime, or I'm talking on the telephone with them.
Okay. So what are you experiencing what are your clients experiencing? And what have you learned as you've reflected on that in helping them that you might be able to share with, the Wellspring community?
Well, I think that you're not that much different than all of us in terms of experiencing anxiety. I think that the biggest thing that I am dealing with is just what the future is going to be like, as well as the present, and dealing with being shut into the house or into the not being able to see people. I think that's a big thing. I have one client that I've just worked with this morning, and he is going to work every day, but he's a correctional officer. And we talk about trying to stay 6 feet away from people. He has to be right in the midst of dormitories where there's hundreds and hundreds of people. And, his anxiety is, affecting his health. He's not sick. He doesn't have the COVID-19, but he's intense. It affects his ability to sleep. The DOC is calling him in to work double shifts because people are getting sick. Clients are getting sick. One of the places where he works, they had a riot not too long ago because inmates were not getting masks and things like that. So there's been a lot of stress. I have other professional people that I'm working with, some pastors that I'm working with that are dealing themselves with their congregants and stress and so forth. And it's just putting a whole level of stress on everyone. I have, just as I was walking in here today, I had a client that just contacted me saying that they want to see us. He and his wife want to see us because they're about ready to break up and they're married. So being together 24/7, if you have a shaky marriage to begin with, it intensifies it. If you're working and bringing the potential of the virus home, there's stress there. So, yeah, I guess to answer your question, there's just all sorts of stress. There's depression, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Your story about the couple reminds me when my dad retired, my mom said, "Richard, I married you for better or for worse, but not for lunch." And that can create a lot of stress. And one of the things that helped me think about this was I read an article last week where the person said, not everyone is experiencing the symptoms of the virus, thank God, but we're all experiencing stress. And there's a global pandemic of stress. And so, Chantal, you talked about in the midst of feeling the anxiety, on top of that, there was another layer of guilt and shame because you were thinking, I'm a Christian. I shouldn't be troubled by this. I'm a mental health professional. I should know better. So talk to us a little bit about, because I'm sure there's folks who are watching and listening tonight. They've got the same issues, and it's just tough to admit, I'm really struggling.
And I think that's a really good question, because I think a lot of times stress and pressure really brings things to the surface. And I think previously to like this pandemic, there probably was like a baseline of like shame and guilt like anyway in there, just from like intervals and things that I've experienced in my life. But I think a lot of us, especially around mental health, we really have like shame and guilt. And it's just a stigma to have any like mental illness or any mental health like difficulties. And a pandemic is no different, even though it might make more cognitive sense that people are having a difficult time. We still feel like in our own might, we should be able to handle it. Or as a Christian, I should be able to lean into God, and that should just be enough. And that was a very difficult thing that I had to come to terms with and understand that even though I am a Christian, I still am a physical being, and stress changes my capacity and the amount of things and how I function. And if I don't recognize that, and if I don't recognize that a pandemic is trauma, trauma doesn't have to just be like a car accident or an assault or a loss in your life. It can be a chronic thing, and it can be global. And I think that this pandemic is traumatic. And I think that I had to come to terms with, I think, just my humanness, and that it affected me, and that it's okay that it affected me. And I'm going to push in past what my mind is telling me, whether that guilt or shame is kind of like blocks to actually progress. And I'm going to push in through that so that I can work on what I'm experiencing and still partnering with God, but that the increased level of stress, it's going to make it harder for me to function, and for that just to feel like it's enough. Even though I know it's enough in my heart, it is enough. My body at this moment is so stressed, and that there is such anxiety that it might not feel real right now. And I think that that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I think sometimes we have the thought that, well, if I'm trusting God, this shouldn't affect me. But sometimes the reality is we're going through something that's overwhelming. That's a given. So if we're going to trust God, we're going to need to be intentional about how we walk out that trust. It's not just automatic. And so I appreciate what you shared in terms of your intentionality. And I think one of the other things that happened in the midst of that, you had a built-in advantage in that you could call your sister and you could go live with her, because we're all deprived of the normal social contact, which just goes such a long way to our mental health stability. And that's a deficit we're all experiencing right now. Now, Keith, Chantal mentioned trauma and that the whole world is being traumatized right now. I know you've done quite a bit of thinking about how the present situation of trauma impacts people who've had past traumas. Maybe you could talk a little bit with us about that.
I think someone has said that it's like present traumatic stress disorder. And I think we're dealing with that. And if you could just kind of bear with me and visualize 3 circles. And the first circle, the lower one, is your past. And the middle circle is your present. And the top circle up here is your future. And what happens a lot of times, and as Chantal has said, is that when stress enters the picture, and we are certainly under stress, don't fool yourselves. Don't think that it's just the people that are out of work or that are sick that are stressed. We're all stressed. And so stress produces thoughts and emotions that go back to our past. And if we've had situations of trauma, or if we've had situations where we felt abandoned, or we felt rejected, or we felt lonely, or we felt like we should be able to measure up and get ourselves out of this, and we're not doing that. If we've had those past experiences, they can fuel the current situation so that The panic attacks, like Chantal has indicated, come more greatly and seem greater than what the situation really is because it has connected to the past experiences. And then on top of that, if you're not careful, the present situation of stress can also trigger how you see the future. And so if you see the future in a destructive way, or just maybe even a human way of just scared, then you see that as perhaps hopeless. Maybe you've lost your job and now you think everything's going to go down the tube. Maybe you've been sick, or you're afraid of being sick. You're wondering what's going to happen in the future. And that can impact how you see things as the present. And if you can look at these three circles, the past, the present, and the future, and you see a bigger circle around that, that is your sphere of influence. And if your influence is negative, if you turn on the television and you listen to all the negativity, if you have guilt and shame and things that come from the enemy, those influence will build up and intensify and exacerbate those emotions in all three spheres. And what I'd like to be able to do is and what I've been working a lot with my clients is to try to stay as much in the present as you can, except for if you move over into the sphere and you look into the sphere as positive and as godly, then there are things in your past that can be positive. There are ways that you have coped. And I'm sure that when we talk about coping mechanisms, we're going to look at what has been effective in the past. So there's things in the past that can impact you in a positive way. There's things that are happening in your present that can, if you look at it, can be positive. It may be a stretch at times, but you can, and if you allow God to filter in and influence you, then you will look at things differently. And then the future, if you look at, how can I plan? How can I take advantage of this situation, of time to look and see how I can change the future?
That's great. I'm thinking here, I'm processing, because just before we, sat down to have this session, I was on the phone with a member of our congregation, someone whom I really have a tremendous amount of respect for. He's a trauma survivor. He is a survivor of some pretty severe trauma, and has made incredible progress in his spiritual journey. But he found being overwhelmed, you talked about that larger circle, being overwhelmed by what's going on all around him. He started to break down, and he found himself not just isolated socially, but like withdrawing within himself back to a place that felt very familiar because it felt like the trauma. He was really just beginning to question. Of course, the enemy's voice came in there, like, I should be doing better than this. I thought I'd gotten past all of this, all that to say. And as we began to talk and process, I gave some suggestions, as Chantal talked about, in terms of, what were the disciplines that you utilized over the course of your journey that helped you get to the place where you have been operating? And maybe it's time to pull some of those disciplines back out. And I think, Chantal, you said earlier, when we were first getting started, you said you were very gentle to yourself. And I think that's an important thing, to be kind to ourselves. And oftentimes we don't do that. And one of the analogies I used as I was talking to this friend was, if you're an athlete and you injured your knee and you completely rehabbed your knee, and then you go back and you're playing again, and then you get dinged up again, you wouldn't feel shameful because you re-injured your knee. You would just go back to rehab. You wouldn't heap layers of guilt and shame on yourself because, now I've got to go back to, rehabbing. There's the frustration. I can't play the games. I wish I was doing that. I wish I didn't have to deal with this. But actually, that's part of being human. Well, here's a question. Someone suggested that I might share with you guys. They knew that we were going to do this. And I'll start with you, Chantel. Keith, you might want to plug into this as well. But let's say someone who's part of the Wellspring community who's watching, they have a friend who's experiencing depression. And maybe as they're Zooming or FaceTiming or talking on the phone, their friend says, I'm really depressed. How could you help a friend who's struggling with depression right now? Like, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be helpful to their friend? What are your thoughts about that?
One of the main things that I think just like popped into my head, like when you said that, Rick, was having boundaries. I think that if we go into this thinking that we can be someone's savior or someone's everything, that probably is going to be a detriment to you, the helper, and also the person receiving it. So I would definitely say, even in wanting to help people with anxiety and depression, to still set boundaries for yourself, because it can be all consuming. And so even if that's setting a time of when me and that person are going to talk, like we're going to talk every Tuesday and have like a virtual cup of coffee, like together, that still sets like a parameter of helping them and helping yourself too, because we are communal people and we do need relationship with one another, but it still allows us to set boundaries and to do that well. Another thing that I would say is almost to have like a morning routine and an evening routine. I think as people, one of the biggest things, even if you haven't experienced like any loss because of like COVID, is that our routine is just off. Like I would go to the gym every morning. I can't do that and things like that. And even though things like that are small, I still give myself grace enough to say that's a really big shift for me. And I think if we don't acknowledge those shifts and those changes, then again, we just rationalize our feelings away, and they're just going to build and build and build and build. And one day we're just going to blow up, at the person in front of us at Starbucks. So I just think it's important that we have an understanding that all of our routines are shifted. Mm-hmm. And I would even say for the morning to have to set intentions like for the day, like today I'm going to focus on this, or even declaring certain things over your life. And like me or Keith, we might call that like positive affirmation, but it truly is like a biblical principle as well, calling certain things into our life. And I think that really does set our intention, and it just shifts the atmosphere. And that's just so important. And I would even say to friends to even worship together. Maybe the friend is not a Christian. And so, I guess that's okay. And that would be maybe a little weird. But I definitely think if they are a Christian, to worship with one another, because again, that really does shift the atmosphere, and it shifts our perspective from like linear to what we see to like kingdom. And I definitely think that that's like just a huge thing that was beneficial to me in those times where I could sit in it, or I could like push through it. And then I would also say like a nighttime routine for me is like not planning for your anxiety, because again, you don't want to like make a god of it, but like, okay, if my anxiety is going to come, I'm going to be a warrior, and I'm going to have like my arsenal and my kit ready so that it's going to be a fight. And so by my side, like I keep the Bible, I keep like, again, the Bill Johnson book. I keep, what else is by my bed? I keep things that are going to shift my focus to what I see and what I'm experiencing right now, and shifting it to kingdom. And I think another skill that I would say, whether it's like a coping skill, is journaling. I think it's so important that we get the thoughts that are in our head out, because a lot of those thoughts, like you just said, Rick, they can be the enemies too. Anxiety is not something in kingdom, so that's the enemy. And so I think it's important that if we keep everything in our head, we make it make sense. And I think that that's a huge detriment, in that we need to get it out onto paper. So not that I would recommend rereading journaling. I actually would like say to don't do that. But I think when we get it out, it loses its power. And I think that that's just so important, that we starve anxiety and depression versus fueling it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you. Keith, another question that came up, and I know you've done a lot of work over the years, with clients who've struggled with addictive behavior. So what would you say to someone who, in the midst of all the stress going on, the triggers going on, who is tempted to revert back to some kind of addictive behavior or negative coping habit, that they feel like, hey, I've conquered that, but now I feel like I'm drawn back to the game. What kind of advice could you offer to someone in that situation?
Well, this may sound kind of strange or weird, but I would say that makes sense to me. That a person who has had a destructive behavior as a way of coping with situations with stress, and they've are in recovery, that additional stress like this could just get them to go back into their old destructive behavior, could propel them right back into the old destructive behavior, or be tempted to go back into the old destructive behavior. So it makes sense. I like to look at it as, and I'm not very technical. I'm sure other people that know me know that I'm not very technical, but I know that in my computer upstairs, I have 2 printers. And I have the laser printer that I use all the time, and then I have a color printer. The laser printer is set up into my computer so that when I turn my computer on and I go to print, it's going to go right to the laser printer. If I want it to go to the color printer, I have to command it to go there. And what happens is that, technically, I understand this is correct, that it's a default mechanism. Your computer is going to default to the laser printer. And what happens oftentimes when we're under stress, we're going to either have the tendency or we will default back into the old destructive behavior, because that's common. And a lot of times when we talk about treatment, we talk about the secondary gain. There is things that I wouldn't say positive, but you think they're positive from destructive behavior. And so you go there because it's a quick release, or it's a quick fix. And so you go there, and that would be considered a secondary gain, but it's destructive. So you have to be aware of that, and also learn, if you've tempted or if you've given into temptation, step back, disengage, and understand why. Be graceful to yourself, and get the help that you need. If you need to be able to get to talk to somebody or to Zoom somebody on that's connected to AA or NA or one of the groups or CR groups, do that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I want to say, just kind of like piggybacking off of that, I know that a lot of 12-step recovery groups have closed down. Some of them have gone virtual. But I mean, this would be a great time to, if you're a person, who's struggling with reverting back to some destructive coping techniques, maybe you had an old sponsor who's not your sponsor right now, but you could call them up. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. You could call me, you could call Pastor Wes, you could call Pastor Kevin. Like, we are available. We're here. We're either working from our home or we're working here out of the office, but you can call the church, 860-225-0661. Follow the prompts to any of our extensions. We'd be happy to talk to you. We'd be glad to pray with you, to encourage you. So, we're available, as a pastoral resource as we go through this. We're going to just wrap up here in a moment, but just want to give you guys a chance. Any last thoughts? Anything that you haven't said that you felt like, I really need to share this with the folks tonight? Well, this is your last shot, Chantal. Go for it.
So I want to give some of my tips of like creating a quarantine COVID safety plan. I think it's so important that we have structure and boundaries, and that we create a system where we can, again, like we can starve a lot of the anxiety and depression that we're feeling versus fueling it. And so a lot of the things that we're feeling, I would ask, like, what are you watching? What are you eating? What are you doing? What's the music that you're listening to? A lot of these external sources are actually fueling the anxiety and stress. Like, if you go on social media, there's a bunch of conspiracy theorists. There's a bunch of these articles that are just against or for certain viewpoints. And I just think it's so important that we can say, hey, is this a time? Do I really need Facebook? Do I really need Instagram? And I'm not going to lie, for this time, I have not been on social media, at least for over a month, because I had to worry about my own mental health, but I also had to say to myself, the things that I'm saying to my clients, am I doing it for myself? And I have to starve those things. So even if it's watching the news, I'm not saying to not be informed or to put your head underneath the sand, but watching the news past 5 or 6 o'clock, there really is no purpose for that. And if you're starting to wind down in your day, that's only going to amp certain things up. So I would definitely say to have boundaries around the news, to have boundaries around social media, and to create movement throughout the day. Yes, maybe for some people who are deathly afraid to leave the house, there are so many YouTube videos and things where you can walk 5 miles, literally in your bedroom. And so I would definitely say that movement is a part of mental health, and we need to move just to survive. And then finding a community, again, whether that's doing Zoom, calling people, whether that is, there's so many just different things and opportunities for us, get on a prayer call. We really are social creatures, and we need that access to humanity. So that's just what I would say, creating a safety plan and not thinking that this doesn't affect you, because it affects every single person, whether you had a history of mental health issues or not, and to just assume that this is affecting you and then to create a safety plan to help you.
That's great. Thanks, Chantal. Keith, how about you?
Well, from AA, there's an old theory that's called budding, budding, and it stands for building up to a drink. And what it states is that someone who has been drinking alcoholically in the past and is now in recovery and then slips, that they are drunk before they take their first drink. So that leads me to there's really we're kind of have three parts. We have our thinking, our cognitive ability. We have our emotional ability, our emotions that play a very big part in who we are. And then we have the spiritual component, our spirit. And then we have our actions. And if we don't view what we're going through right now, the stress, as a battle, then we're setting ourselves up to allow that thinking and those emotions in our spirit to set us up to the budding process that builds us up to destructive behavior. And so what I would suggest is to go to Ephesians chapter 6 and to realize that what we're facing is a battle, and so we need to equip ourselves. So I would challenge you, and Carrie, I would call this the chew challenge, to really look at the need to put the helmet of salvation on your head and over your thoughts and the way you think, and surrender that to the Lord, and really visually just see yourselves doing that. And then take your heart, which is the center of your emotions, and put the shield or the breastplate of righteousness over your heart, and ask the Lord to position that. And then to the shield of faith, put that in one arm, and the sword of the Spirit, and the belt of truth. And then you walk in the sandals of peace. Now, here's the thing that is so silly about the way I act sometimes, and the tendency we all have. I like football. I like Tom Brady is my hero, okay? Now, Tom Brady is very skilled in what he does. We know that he's one of the best quarterbacks around, if not the best. And we know that he's very skilled. But can you imagine him going out into the football field and playing a game without his uniform on, without his pads on, without the protection that he needs? His skills would be greatly diminished. If not, he would not even be able to play the game at the level that he plays, because he would be injured very quickly. And so if we're not careful, if we don't see this as a battle, as a war that we're in, and equip ourselves, then we will get hurt and injured.
That's good. Yeah. I want to thank you both. I just want to leave this kind of parting thought. It's been really challenging to me. It's been helpful to me. This past Sunday, Pastor Kevin talked about, being in the wilderness. and the wilderness being a time of transition, it's a time of testing. But it's how we navigate the wilderness that determines how we're going to come out of it. And I happened to have a conversation yesterday with Matt Rudolph, and as we were sharing back and forth, Matt said, and he had just kind of set his heart that he wanted to come, he didn't want to just get through this. He wanted to position his heart so that he came out of this, better equipped, closer to the Lord, prepared to move forward after this is over. And we can be intentional about this. I think if we think this is just going to happen automatically, we're fooling ourselves. We have to be intentional about it. That's why we've been doing this tonight, to help you be prepared. So I'll just leave you with this invitation. This coming Sunday morning, I'm going to be doing the teaching. And there's a biblical strategy that I want to share this coming Sunday that's built right into the framework of the Scriptures. It's a biblical form of processing deep and at times heavy and negative emotions that allows us to work them all the way through our system, to release them to God, and then be able to move forward into hope. And I'm going to share some of that with you this coming Sunday. Just want to say God bless you to all the Wellspring family, all the friends who are watching. We're glad that we can be with you this way. Can't wait till we can be together. But I'll just say, go in peace, to walk in mental health, to walk in emotional wholeness, to walk in spiritual vitality, to do all these things so that we might love and serve the Lord. Amen.